Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Abdi Latif Dahir. I'm the East Africa correspondent for the New York Times. Welcome to this session. Before we bring our speakers, the rest of our panelists here, I'm gonna flip the script here and put Max Bearak, our climate correspondent, on the spot. Thanks for moderating that session on the climate tipping points. But I want us to discuss something else, which is particularly a very interesting and crucial number, which is the 600 million people in this continent who do not have electricity, and the 1.2 billion others who must rely on firewood and charcoal for cooking. And particularly over the past several months, you know, with the war in Ukraine, there's been a lot of conversation, particularly around what's the global transition to clean energy, who gets to keep using fossil fuels and how long. And you have covered both the war in Ukraine on the ground and have recently also turned to looking at different energy options, particularly in the continent, the type of discussions that the leaders in the continent are having, which we will hear more of in a minute. But could you just talk a little bit about what you've been hearing from both European leaders or leaders in the West, and vis-a-vis how other African leaders are thinking about this?
Well, thanks for that question. I mean, I think it's the most fundamental of them. And the word that comes to mind and that keeps coming up in my reporting on this is unfairness. And that unfairness comes from a history of colonialism and then economic domination from Europe over Africa that has resulted in centuries of extraction and depletion of resources with very little benefit on Africa's part for that. And because of that, Europe and other parts of the world developed rapidly in ways that Africa didn't, and feels, of course, rightly that it deserves to. And so the conversation about Africa's energy future is in some ways, it's the same conversation as one about, what is owed to Africa in some ways, right? That said, I think that most people that you'll speak to, leading an African country or climate activists from that country too, will say that that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do exactly what other parts of the world did and pollute the atmosphere and contribute to global warming to develop. But there need to be pathways for development that are collectively created and funded, most importantly. And that money, for the reasons that I was just talking about, isn't in Africa for the most part now. It needs to be made available, and that is the foundation of so many of the conversations across the past couple of days and for the rest of this conference.
You touched on two very important issues, which is the continent suffers the most from climate change, the impact of climate change, but there's also a lot of untapped fossil fuel and reserves, particularly in light of the war in Ukraine, and this sort of a lot of governments, and we're going to hear from the policymakers and the activists in a little bit, but what type of opportunity does this open, particularly the war that is now raging in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's seen by some, especially in leadership, as leverage. There's a crisis in obtaining energy in Europe right now, in fact, around the world. And in the short-term scramble that is happening right now, there's an opportunity for that funding and financing that I was talking about. And the war in Ukraine doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. That scramble also doesn't seem like it'll end anytime soon, although, of course, there is an acceleration away from some of those fuels like liquefied natural gas that are available in large quantities, just untapped quantities across a lot of Africa.
Will the realization of some of these projects like quickly turn into actually electricity coming into the homes of Africans, or?
I mean, the knee-jerk reaction I have is no, and that's the continuation of the unfairness of all of this. It may result in increased revenue in a lot of African countries. That hasn't really happened yet necessarily. I think the amount of new gas shipments that have gone from African countries that are not the traditional producers like Algeria and Egypt is infinitesimally small, really. Maybe a little bit from the Republic of Congo and from Mozambique at this point. So no, I don't see this as like the turning point, if you will, for African governments to have more leverage to create energy for their own industry and for their own citizens.
Thank you, Max. I'm going to invite three more panelists to the stage so that they can also enrich our conversation and who have been working on this for decades. Please join me in welcoming Omar Elmawi, who is the coordinator of the Stop EACOP campaign. We also have Mohamed Ado, the founder and director of PowerShift Africa. And joining us virtually is Papa Sambaba, the Minister of Petroleum and Energies of Senegal. Welcome. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. This is very exciting. I want to start with you, Mohamed. We've just talked about like electricity provision in the continent, and we've also talked about, how Africa, contributes around only 3% of global historic emissions. Some leaders, particularly since the war in Ukraine have started, have talked a lot about gas and natural gas, yet you have described investment in African gas as a folly. Could you a little bit elaborate like what you meant by that and how you've been thinking about that issue?
Yeah, thank you, Abdi. Firstly, it's sad that the world is coming to realize we have an energy crisis when Europe feels it. In the continent of Africa, we have over 600 million people without electricity, close to 1 billion people without clean cooking. And so how come that we have an energy crisis when a historic polluter in Europe was largely developed on the back of fossil fuels and in the process caused climate change, experiences a rise in the prices as a result of the Russian war in Ukraine, rather than the scandal of energy poverty that Africa and other developing parts of the world faces. So when you look at the international discourse and the international dialogue, the way it's actually set up tends to privilege the polluter. And it's set up in a way that we only talk about the energy crisis and also the climate crisis when it hits the wealthy countries. And so because of that crisis, what we now have is a dash for African gas. So until 2021, in the Glasgow Climate Conference, the historic polluters were talking about ending financing for fossil fuels. Europe was developing its carbon border adjustment program so that they can actually penalize commodities from the rest of the world that have had high carbon. And all of that has now been forgotten. And Europe is effectively backpedaling and wanting to turn Africa into its gas station. And so unless we actually challenge the way the dialogue and the discourse is set up to only start engaging some of the challenges around energy access and the climate crisis, when it hits the north, rather than thinking about an international cooperation approach where collectively the whole world start to think about the converging crises around energy, development, finance that we're going through, and work together in solidarity to address that. And so the reason I call the whole dash for gas and this interest in African fossil gas as a folly for Africa is because you have an energy poor continent, and not because we lack the renewable energy capacity or even the fossil fuel capacity. It's largely because of how we've been entrapped and how, as a result of colonialism, the whole African economy and the way the political economy has also been organized to actually help service the needs of the developed world economies. So a lot of our infrastructure is currently meant to help service others' interests by way of exports. And so even the expansion in fossil fuels and gas particularly, it's not meant to help address our energy poverty. It's meant to help actually make up for the loss of fossil gas from Russia. And so unless we break this vicious circle, there's no way Africa is going to attain energy sovereignty.
Thanks for that. But what about those who might say that, this is also an opportunity? It fattens the wallets of African governments, and it could, that's money that could contribute to economic development.
Yeah. So think of it this way. Why did Africa miss out on the opportunity of its natural resources in the last 6 decades? Nigeria is the biggest, exporter of fossil fuels. Nigeria isn't energy secure. Nigeria isn't relatively more developed than the rest of the continent. And I'm only taking the example of Nigeria, but you could also think of Angola, Sudan. None of these countries have actually materially, felt, the resources that they've actually been endowed with. And so we need to think about, what IES said about, the fact that the expansion of fossil fuels is not compatible, with the global objective of limiting global heating to below 1.5. And that is only from a climate perspective. Now think of it from a development perspective. At a time when the rest of the world is actively working to transition away from fossil fuels, locking Africa on a pathway that is actually going to result in stranded assets, and asking a continent that is relatively poor to use its limited financial resources to develop an energy system largely for exports when we could easily leapfrog that energy and become green leaders. None of us in the continent of Africa had the privilege of a fixed phone connection. And all of us now carry smartphones. And no African leader said and developed fixed line telephone before we leapfrog to mobile phones. Now, why can't we do the same, given the maturity of renewable energy technology that are also becoming increasingly cost-effective, leapfrog that energy, become a green leader? We missed out on the fossil fuel industrialization that has powered the prosperity in the rich world. We could now chart a different alternative path where Africa becomes the leader. What I see is an opportunity for Africa to become a renewable energy superpower if our leaders only seize the opportunity. But if we're going to be led by the interest of the historical polluter, who've in part grown rich by polluting without facing the cost of doing so, and the rest of us being impacted by climate change, then we will lock ourselves into a pathway where we will end up with stranded assets and we will miss out on the opportunity that renewables offer. So what we need is Africa led by Africans for Africa, where endogenous ideas effectively help to decolonize how Africa develops its energy system, because there's no way we will decarbonize without decolonizing.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm going to turn to Papa Samba now, but before I do that, I would just like to remind the audience that we will take questions at the end of the session, and so if you're able to write the questions in the note cards, and a runner will come get them from you in a minute. But Papa Samba, I mean, Senegal has been exploring a lot of partnerships with countries, like European countries, and a lot of companies too. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about where some of those discussions stand, and why particularly you're doing a lot of these explorations right now.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And first of all, I would like to congratulate the two people just spoke a few minutes ago. I think, yes, Senegal made several world-class discoveries of natural gas since 2015 now. And by next year, we start the production of the first project, that is the Grand Tortue Armée, that we are sharing with Mauritania, what is a great, history for African continent to cooperate around.
I think we might have lost him, but we'll bring him back. Omar, I want to quickly turn to you because you have been on the front lines of actually campaigning, fighting against fossil fuel, whether it's with the coal plants originally in Kenya, and then now with the East African crude oil pipeline that is going to traverse both Uganda and Tanzania. Could you talk a little bit about that and how the campaign is going on today?
Definitely. Thanks for the question. And it's true, I'm not very much loved in the fossil fuel industry because much of my career pathway has been about speaking against them. Because in my experience and what I've seen, as Mohammed has begun to say, it's not really about the interest of Africans and about developing Africans. It's mostly about exploiting these resources for the benefits of the wealthier nations. If I was to just mention an example on the Lamu coal plant, this is a project that the Kenyan government signed to produce about 1,000 or 1 gigawatt of electricity from coal at a time when everyone else is moving away from coal. China is making this commitment about not funding new coal plants in the world, but then our country decides this is the opportune time to do such kind of a project that's going to be affecting people. It's going to be affecting people in different areas, both livelihoods, health, among different other issues. And it's also going to be a huge economic burden because Kenya is a country that is already producing overcapacity, and therefore they don't need the electricity that they're producing. And the way that these agreements for electricity, how they're being structured, is you pay for the power whether you use it or not. And what that would have meant will be Kenyans would have to be paying a lot of money for an electricity utility they don't need. For the East African crude oil pipeline, as the second example, it's going to be the longest heated crude oil pipeline in the world. After Uganda discovered that they have oil reserves in around 2006, they decided the best option is to advertise and invite people to come in and exploit these resources. The unfortunate thing is they're not even exploiting it for Ugandans and Tanzanians. It's the reason why they're building the pipeline, so that they can export all this oil all the way to another country, put it in tankers and take it to the rest of the world, when they've signed agreements that actually make them minority shareholder of the same project. They've given tax exceptions for the whole project, and they'll be left with all the impact that's going to be based for the people, for nature, for livelihoods. I mean, more than 100,000 people are going to be displaced just to have this pipeline. Several other economic sectors are going to be impacted. We're talking about agriculture, fishermen, and different other livelihoods. And then there's also the aspect around the huge carbon bomb about this project is going to be, because they're going to be taking about 200,000 barrels of oil a day that's going to be utilized somewhere, which is going to be pumping more than 34 million tons of CO2 every year. And that means it's a huge, huge problem. And why we are saying no to these kinds of projects is not because we are against government projects, because we don't want development. It's because we know better. We know what we need to do for us to develop. Uganda is, and Africa in general, has a lot of potential around community-led renewable energy. I mean, talk about all the different options, wind, solar, geothermal, all options you're having around renewables, we have it in the whole continent. We have the world's most potential for solar, for instance, but only about 1% of the world's global solar capacity is from Africa, which means it's a place that we haven't tapped into and utilized all of these options. Why we are seeing companies which are coming to Africa not interested about renewables is because it's hard for you to export renewables, right? I mean, you won't be able to capture wind and take it to Europe and then be generating electricity. But you can take oil and take it somewhere else and utilize it. And therefore, if really what we want is development, what we want is for this continent to proceed and be better and its people, then the best option and the best gamble that we have is on renewables, which is in plentiful, and it's going to really, really improve the status of this continent.
You raised an interesting point, which is that a lot of these projects are not being built for the communities within which they're being built. Could you talk a bit about the alliances that you're forming with these fishermen, with these communities around this pipeline, and how they're even thinking about, how you're making them even understand or even debate or discuss the nuances of climate change and what this will mean for them?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because a lot of the times when we're speaking against or we're speaking about projects, we adopt a high-level discussion where we co-opt all these important grassroots voices, which are really important in this discussion. So what we've been doing in all the places that I've been involved is, one, we never do anything without consulting and knowing what the community wants. So we need to have a discussion with them so that we need to understand what's development for them, what do they need to see happening. Is it energy? Is it something else? And also make sure that we speak to them so that they understand the different issues that they have and they can engage in the different discussions that we have. Because if we don't do this, then we end up, one, looking like we are the same people. You know, we're very, as CSOs, we're very good at complaining when the government doesn't involve us in different discussions, but then we do the same mistakes when we attempt to speak on behalf of the community. So it's important for people to understand that these are not ignorant people who don't have an idea about what they need, but they are experts in their own right. Otherwise, you won't have all of these resources that we want to go and steal from where they are currently based. So it's important to speak to them, understand their perspective, and make sure that they are able to speak on these issues so that anyone, anywhere, will be knowing that this is not Omar who's speaking, this is the community from this particular area who's speaking about an issue that's dear to them. And then for us, then it doesn't just become about funding, about money, but it's more about people who are owning the fight and the struggles because it's dear and they feel like they own everything that has been discussed within that discussion.
Thank you, Omar, and glad to have you back, Papa Samba. Could you just maybe continue giving us an update on how Senegal is exploring the development of gas and what those discussions, where those discussions are today?
Yeah, sure. Actually, as I was saying, we are sharing with Mauritania one of the major projects that is going on the continent right now, that is GTA Grand Termine, with the objective to start producing LNG by next year, end of next year, for the international market, but also some share of such gas will supply the domestic market for supporting the gas to power strategies of Senegal and Mauritania in order to decrease the cost of production of the electricity, but also supporting the universal access on which our countries are working. At the same time, Senegal also have another project that is the Yaka-Teranga, with the same level of natural gas, and altogether, right now, Senegal is sitting around 30 TCF of natural gas. This stage, the aim of Senegal in this gas adventure is to have a fair and environmental friendly development, but also in order to support its industrialization and the economic development of Senegal. It is very important, the subject that you are making. It is about the future of Africa energy. And I think as Senegal, several countries in the continent right now have such a kind of resources where they are said not to develop it, or that are under the threat of financing limitation on the international market. And this is why you are seeing a lot of our leaders claiming loud and clear that the fairness in terms of exploitation of these fossil energy and natural gas in particular need to be guaranteed to Africa, and while recognizing the full commitment of Africa in order to participate actively in the climate change battle that the world is facing. And in Africa, we have a lot of great experiences for the development of those renewable energy. We need to push up such a kind of experience, but at least the global strategy need to be on two hands. On two hands, the first one will be the exploitation of the natural gas, and the second hand being how to develop this renewable energy, how to build some storage capacity of such renewable energy, and also how to industrialize our country through these natural gas and the mineral resources that need to be monetized in Africa in order to have the greatest value, creating jobs for our young leaders, also our youth that are representing more than half of our population, and also for developing the economy of our country. So right now, in the frame of the discussion during this COP, it is, I think, more and more recognized such a right of African continent, but we need really to ensure that anywhere where such a kind of discussion is made, either in the UN or in G20 or elsewhere, Africa needs to be represented and to be a full member. That means reform of the international governance in order to have Africa that will sit at the decision level so that its priorities and should be taken into account in the frame of the say international commitment in terms of environment.
Thank you. I want to ask a follow-up question to that in terms of like these agreements also, or explorations at least that you're doing, which is how are you guarding against the fact that maybe some of these companies are profit-seeking, they want to dig these fossil fuels quite quickly, and then worries that, you know, some of our panelists have in terms of like the fact that they're going to leave you with all these stranded assets in the future when, say, the Russian war in Ukraine is over? How are you thinking about that?
No, this is what I was pointing out, saying that the risk of stranded asset is related somehow to the orientation on the international market only. We need to diversify our position as a continent in order also to develop our domestic market. Our natural gas, our resources are not useful for the international market. This is where, by developing the African energy sector, by developing the African industry market, we can really create value locally in order to support the development of such assets. And just to add that today, African is consuming less than about 30 times less than American people. And you see the level of development. This is not to say that we need to target such a kind of energy consumption. We need to be really rational in our energy consumption, but we have a lot of room in terms of development to create such value.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a reminder to write down your questions, and then you can raise your hand so that the mic runners can come in and get them from you. We'll open up in just a couple of minutes. But I want to ask you, Mohammed, in terms of like just the way you think about the future, and particularly the Pan-African, if there's a Pan-African collective thought around what the energy future of the continent is going to look like, and how to approach that.
The continent of Africa is at a crossroads with two possible futures. You know, the continent can transition and become a clean energy leader, where renewables, power our societies and our economies, and that way we secure our people's well-being, and we actually help in ensuring thriving ecosystems and a stabilized global climate. Or we can become a major polluter. And follow the path of the historic polluters, and lock ourselves on an energy pathway that is going to leave majority of our population still energy poor. If you look at the way the fossil energy system is built, it's largely centralized, and given the sparse population in a lot of our rural areas, it will never deliver sustainable energy access. Now, the alternative vision is an Africa that is actually led by Africans for Africa to help meet the needs of Africans in a climate-stabilized world. That future is going to require Africa to leapfrog that energy, become a green leader, and for the current 600 million Africans without electricity, and if you look at the actual data, the continent of Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, consumes less energy than Spain. 17% of the global population, consuming less energy than a country that has less than 1% of the global population. So this is the scandal of, the energy poverty that the continent is facing. And when you look at actual per capita consumption of electricity, I think we consume about 180 kilowatts per hour in the continent of Africa. You compare that to Europe, 6,500. You compare that to America, 13,000 kilowatts per hour. So our energy consumption is very low at the moment. And there's no way we will be able to attain the level of development if we don't develop our energy infrastructure. But the question is, what energy is fit for purpose and right for Africa? And this is a question that I will appeal, particularly our political leadership, to engage us on. There's an opportunity with Africa becoming a renewable energy leader. That opportunity can only be realized if we build a Pan-African vision where the 17% of the global population that resides in Africa that is majority energy poor now chooses to leapfrog and leave the fossil resources in the ground, and then repackages the Paris Agreement nationally determined contributions as investment tools that will offer the world an opportunity to avoid growth in emissions so that we actually contribute by way of leading in the transition. If you look at the way the international climate dialogue is set up, and the reason we've never been able to actually reasonably deliver on the 1.5 degree is that it's actually framed as a burden. And it's largely around cutting emissions, implying that as you cut emissions, you're compromising on your development. But the continent of Africa is energy poor, okay? So there's no development to compromise. But there are hopes to build and secure based on the energy pathway and the development pathway we pursue. Now, if we reconstructed and introduced a narrative around avoided emissions and paid Africa for avoiding emissions so that as we develop our energy infrastructure, we can leapfrog and the historic polluters pay Africa what they owe Africa and the rest of the developing countries by way of climate debt, you will have the climate finance and you'll have the clean technology that is going to be made available to help the world live within the 1.5 degree. But what do our leaders do? Our leaders, without internalizing what is really at stake in a climate-constrained world, are basically intimidated by our former colonizers and made to prepare nationally determined contributions that have been paid for by consultants from the former colonizers without engaging ordinary Africans around the development pathway and the energy pathway that is right for Africa. And the only reason they do that is so that the West can bully the emerging economies using the NDCs that the vulnerable countries are putting forward and shame the Chinas and the Indias. So it's not built within a global corporation where you actually facilitate, endogenous ideas and countries providing leadership and charting the right path for themselves in a world where we collectively pull to help develop and keep within a 1.5 degree. So the energy colonialism is effectively what is driving the energy choices in Africa. The reason you have a dash for gas in Africa and this scramble for African gas, it's not different what Berlin decided many years ago, scrambling for the continent of Africa. So we need to say no to those leaders who want to lock us on a gas pathway and assume leadership in the continent so that we chart ourselves a path for our own well-being. And that is my appeal to my dear colleagues and leaders so that we take ownership of our energy and we actually deliver energy sovereignty for Africa.
Thank you. We'll take a question. Oh. Oh.
Hello, my name is Ashani, and a lot of what you said resonated because I'm from Sri Lanka, and I feel like a lot of people from former colonies have a colonial hangover. It's not just our leaders, but we want to develop the way of the West when, you know, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is huge in this Indian subcontinent as well. And people are seeing that development and are seduced by that development. And I don't think it's just the leaders, I think it's also the general public. So how do you think we can bridge that gap and show people that we can have, you know, an African vision or an Asian vision that is separate to the West when people don't have that idea and can't build that idea? How do we challenge the existing colonial hangover and get over it?
Do you want to go for it?
Yeah. So the only way is what our forefathers did when they fought for our independence. At that time, they were kicking the colonizers out of our territories. And if you look at the history of Africa, you know, around the 70s, there are a lot of, you know, very creative thinking emerging out of the continent. But a lot of those were supported by the Bretton Woods institutions using the structural adjustment program. You know, you have, you know, institutions like the World Bank coming in, effectively denying Africa the opportunity to subsidize the agriculture, but effectively lock Africa into food imports. And because we now have food imports, we haven't actually developed our agriculture to produce rice or wheat. We're in Egypt. Egypt doesn't produce wheat. What do we produce in many parts of Africa? We produce coffee, we produce cocoa, and a lot of it is driven by this hunger for, you know, foreign exchange. What is the foreign exchange then for? It's basically to pay the debt that is largely dominated in US dollars. So you've structurally been trapped, and you're basically servicing your former colonizers, and unless you basically take control of your destiny and realize that these structural deficiencies that have been created are actually entrapments, and you work towards food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, because it's important. If you look at the continent of Africa, why do we have to produce for exports low value-added commodities and then continue to import, you know, finished products when we could actually develop industrial policies and also subsidize our agriculture in a way that we can actually have agroecological production? So the challenge for me is the mind has to be, I think our minds have been constrained in a way that we only look things from how the rest actually look at us, rather than assuming our own agency as individuals, as communities, and as countries who are in complete control of their destiny. So my appeal to you, friends, is the revolution of our continent and the revolutions of the global south, so that we can be led by endogenous-led ideas that effectively look out for the interests of the communities within a safe climate. You won't have a safe climate without those two things.
Thank you very much. Just to our time is almost up. So to each of the speakers, like, you know, as you get, could you just take like half a minute to sort of like reflect on what do you think should or could happen at COP over the next week or so, in terms of particularly thinking about investment and the kind of infrastructure that Africa needs, so that a lot more people can get access. So we'll start with Omar and then go to Max, and then finish with Papa Samba.
Thanks, Abdi. I mean, there's something we call the law of holes, right? And what it says is when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you do is you stop digging, right? You don't continue digging when you find yourself in a problem. And what we have in Africa is a new colonialist approach in terms of how we're looking at energy, and we've been servicing other people's needs. And I think for the first time in our lives, we need to act a little bit selfish and think about what's in the best interest of Africans, for us to invest in energy options that are really providing development options for people. In terms of what we are hoping to see at COP, I mean, Africa has contributed the least to the climate change and the crisis that we have, and I think it's only fair that those who've been historically gotten us to where we are today, that one, they need to publicly apologize for the problem that they've caused us, because it's not about theory and statistics, it's about people's lives and livelihoods that have been affected significantly. I think it's also important for them to provide the finances for us to move on to the pathway that we need to go to. And by financing, I don't mean loans. I don't mean giving people loans and determining what they're supposed to be doing, but actually giving money that they can invest in options that are going to get us into the climate solution that we need. And then finally, it's about time that we stop talking about fake solutions. I mean, the geoengineering issues and all these other things we're speaking about. I mean, it's only mad people who keep doing things the same way and expecting a different result. So this narrative is not taking us anywhere, and we can't necessarily be gambling with people's lives, the 8 billion people that we have within this whole world.
Max?
I think quickly I would just say that one thing to pay attention to is African countries and Caribbean countries and other G77 countries coming together to try and push not just for loss and damage funds. That's one thing, but I think even more importantly is a wholesale reform push of international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the kind of Washington consensus that developed after World War II, which has trapped much of the world in kind of debt peonage, essentially, for most of these countries' independent lives at this point. And until that system is fundamentally reformed, then we have these cycles of, there's a crisis and Africa can find some leverage in it, but really it's a short-lived benefit as opposed to not having that kind of debt burden that keeps those governments beholden to former colonizers.
Thank you. Papa Samba, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I think I will start where my colleague just finished about the reforms. And really, it is one subject on which we need to progress in order to secure the presence of African continent and African representative in all the decision areas. And the second point, I think, in terms of also to have less oriented, less Western oriented in the decision and the view of the approach that are adopted for energy. Energy, we need really in Africa for our future to develop our local market in order to support, not to be less dependent on the decision and the pathway and the other. This stage, we need to fully develop all our renewable energy capacities in order to take profit of this sun, of this wind that the continent is, and the hydroelectricity also of the continent that the continent have to. Energy security, industry security, and let's say all agriculture security is not work only for other countries, for other continents, other areas. Africa needs to put such a concept and such a reality in, at the heart of its politics and at the heart of this energy politics, the energy security in particular. So thank you.
Thank you, Papa Samba. Omar Mawi, Mohamed Ado, Max Bearak, thank you all very much. And thanks for being here today. It was an honor moderating the session.